This is Leva, manager of podcast and audio here at Race Forward, and welcome to what is truly a momentous occasion. Momentum, a Race Forward podcast recorded at the White House. It is my honor to introduce our featured guest for this special episode, Chiraag Bains, now former Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council for Racial Justice and Equity. This interview took place towards the end of his tenure. In this role, he supervised the Domestic Policy Council's efforts on democracy and voting rights, criminal justice, disability, Native affairs, the racial wealth gap, and broad equity portfolios. His work includes the implementation of President Biden's Executive Orders 13985, advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government, and more recently, Executive Order 14091, further advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. From 2018 to 2021, Chiraag was the Director of Legal Strategies at Demos, where he supervised a national docket of voting rights litigation and led the organization's democracy reform policy development. From 2010 to 2017, he served in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, where he was awarded the Attorney General's Award for Exceptional Service. As Senior Counsel to the Assistant Attorney General, he supervised matters from special litigation, voting, housing and civil enforcement, and appellate sections, and helped lead the Department of Justice's work on criminal justice reform. He co-wrote the Ferguson Report and sued the city of Ferguson, Missouri over unconstitutional policing and court practices. Our first co-host is Cathy Albisa. She is Race Forward's Vice President of Institutional and Sectoral Change. She oversees our Government Alliance on Race and Equity, GARE work, and our Federal Initiative on Race and Equity, FIRE work. Cathy was also the co-founder and former executive director of Partners for Dignity and Rights, a social movement organization that supports community groups across the country in their campaigns for structural change. She serves on the Human Rights Commission in New York City and has published on economic and social rights, racial and gender justice, and human rights. Joining her is Carlton Eley, Race Forward's Senior Director for Federal Strategies. In his role since 2021, Carlton has managed Race Forward's work as it comes to the opportunities generated by President Biden's Executive Order 14091. Prior to this role, Carlton was a member of the Miami Valley Regional Planning Commission in Dayton, Ohio, and was the 2021 Sojourner Truth Fellow. He is a former civil servant whose career with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency spanned more than 20 years and is an accomplished expert on the topic of equitable development. So with that, here's Momentum, a Race Forward podcast from the White House.
Welcome, Chiraag. We're so glad to have you here. Let's start with our first question. Can you describe what it was like for you, the first, that moment that President Biden signed the first executive order on racial equity? As someone who has done this work really all your adult life, right? You've committed so much to it. And knowing it was such a marked departure from what was happening before in the previous administration, what was that moment like for you and people around you?
Thank you for the question, Cathy, and thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be on this podcast and to be able to talk about that moment, and thank you for bringing me back to it. It was a big deal to have the president sign that executive order, and not just that he signed the executive order, but that it was the first day of the administration. The president said when he was running for office and during the transition that racial equity would be a key pillar of his presidency. And he made that real by issuing that executive order, which was bold, ambitious, detailed, and created a mandate for every federal agency, all parts of the White House, the entire federal government, to acknowledge the reality of systemic discrimination and structural racism, to acknowledge the way in which underserved communities of all types have been left out of opportunity and blocked out of government resources and programs for generations, and that it was their responsibility, our responsibility, to do things differently this time around. And it's really a matter of just government working for people, but government working for all people. And that is something that had never been done before. No president had ever issued a mandate this sweeping and this focused on racial equity and equity more broadly. So for me, as a civil rights lawyer, I came up prosecuting cases of police brutality, hate crimes, other civil rights crimes, and litigating voting rights cases. For me to have my president, who I had joined up to serve, say this is going to be at the core of my administration, it was a game changer and gave me the energy that I needed to hit the ground running right away.
I'm sure it was profound. And I'm sure, Carlton, you'll have some questions here too for Chiraag, given that you had many years in government yourself and must have some curiosities about what this executive order meant now that you weren't.
Yeah, thank you, Cathy. Chiraag, I really appreciate everything that you and the administration have had the opportunity to do over the span of the past 2.5 years. I worked for the federal government for roughly about 20 years, and a framing around racial equity as clear and as explicit of this was void during the years when I was a civil servant. So you've had the opportunity to reflect on what it was like when the first executive order was signed. Could you speak a little bit to what were the goals of the administration as they set on the path to elevate racial equity as a policy priority? Because really that was landmark to go ahead and lean in on this as a policy priority. And what early impacts were you able to see?
Yeah, Carlton, I was a career employee as well of the federal government in the Justice Department. And I can say from that position, maybe this is what you were speaking to as well, that it matters what the message is from leadership, from the president on down to agency leadership, to your line supervisors. And a major goal of this executive order was to say equity has to be prioritized. And what does equity mean? Equity means the just and impartial treatment of all people, so that everyone has an opportunity to live a secure life, economically secure life, have access to opportunity, to thrive, to be their best selves, and that we in government have a role in making that a reality. And it starts by saying that we need to acknowledge, I mentioned this a moment ago, but we need to acknowledge that government has been part of the problem in the past, right? Whether we talk about excluding Black and Brown Americans from major government benefits programs over the years, or redlining. There's just many examples of the federal government playing a clear role excluding people from opportunity. And this time around, it shall not be the case. This time around, it's the government's responsibility, again, from the leadership in the White House to supervisors to line staff to, in whatever corner of the federal government you are operating, to identify those barriers to underserved communities and then develop explicit strategies to overcome those barriers. And that is critical. I would also say that the message is that equity is an expansive concept, right? It's an expansive category. I know that there are some who will try to pigeonhole this as a matter of helping only some Americans, but we reject the notion that there's a zero-sum game here, and that comes from the president. The president does not feel that by helping some people, you hurt others. Right. Equity, it does mean paying attention to groups that have been historically excluded from opportunity. We're talking about people of color, religious minorities, LGBTQI plus Americans, people who live in rural communities that have been historically suffered from disinvestment, and other categories of folks who just haven't been able to avail themselves of the full promise of the American dream. And by helping those groups and by ensuring that there truly is equal opportunity across the board, we help all Americans, right? When we lift some of us up, we lift all of us up. And that has been sort of a signature approach of this administration. In terms of early wins or some of the early impacts that we've seen, we are sitting here today, more than 2 years into the administration. I think it's been an incredibly fruitful period, especially with the first 2 years. The president had partners in Congress and was able to pass the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. I can go on. These bills created historic funding to transform American communities. And the president was explicit that equity had to be a focus in how these monies were made available to communities and how they were spent. It's something we're spending a lot of time on now, making sure that lower capacity communities, communities that have a lower average income, that have fewer government resources, who may not have a grant writer on staff, that they know that these funds exist and they can apply for them and secure them. And then I would say there are a couple of key markers. The first couple of years, you look at, more than 12 million jobs created, unemployment at historic lows of 3.6%, 50-year lows for Black and Brown Americans. The health insurance uninsured rate is down to 8%. And we know that the uninsured population is disproportionately people of color. There are many markers like this that I think we can look at to say we made a major impact in the first couple of years.
Let me back up a minute to, you were talking about the investments that are coming down, right? And this commitment and how vast it is. But we have seen historically big investments come down, right? And actually create inequities. We saw it the first time around with the New Deal. There's a commitment here that these investments go differently, but it's all in the implementation, right? So let's move to the second executive order. Second executive order was also a sweeping document, right? Beautifully written, talking about a multi-generational commitment and a real focus on sustained implementation and relationship with community. Give us your reflections on what you think will happen in this phase of implementation, because we know there will be bumps. We know it won't all go well. We know what the intention is, but what is it that will make us successful so that this time around, historically, we see different outcomes?
Yeah, the second executive order, which the president signed on February 16th, is historic, and it is the result of a lot of learning that happened over the first couple of years and a lot of opportunity that we see going forward. The first executive order, truly historic, never done before. Day one, we talked about that. It had a series of taskings in it to agencies who, again, had never really done this work. This is new. No president had ever issued this kind of a mandate and required this level of work from every agency. And it had in it certain obligations that they had to do self-assessments a certain number of days out from the executive order at certain periods. They had to examine and identify and really dig into the barriers to their programs for underserved communities. And they had to then develop explicit strategies, 3 to 5 strategies in high impact areas of their work, and publish those as part of equity action plans. We did that. Actually, 90 agencies produced these equity action plans, all the cabinet level agencies, as well as 50 independent agencies that weren't even required by the executive order to do so, but they stepped up as well. And that was a set of more than 300 commitments that agencies made, that they made public, and that they can be held accountable for. It was also a one-time exercise according to the first executive order. And we know that equity is not a one-time exercise. It's a generational commitment. It's got to be a repeat process. And we're building a muscle here in government, learning how do we do this? What does it mean to examine ourselves in this way and identify where our programs are falling down, where they're not serving the American people, where people can't access them, and how do we make them more accessible? The second executive order requires that this be a recurring annual process, the process of self-assessment and identifying commitments that they will make as part of these equity action plans. It lines them up with the budget so that they can be properly resourced, and the director of the Office of Management and Budget can make sure that we're seeking from Congress the resources we need for these strategies that agencies come up with. And you're right, there is a major emphasis in this executive order on community engagement. That is, we know that those who are most impacted by the problems we're trying to solve also have solutions. They have ideas, right? They have a sense of what is it that is not working in these programs and how might we improve them. The executive order directs every agency to increase its engagement with underserved communities, again, broadly defined in the categories that I mentioned earlier. This is not just national level groups that have a presence in DC. We're talking about going out into the states, going out into local communities, engaging directly with tribes, making sure we're talking to folks in the territories as well, reaching out not just for sharing information about what programs are available, but also asking for input during the policy development process. That is different. That has not been done sufficiently well never on the scale that we're attempting to now. And so the EO creates an invitation to community groups and individuals across the country to please come to us and please respond to us when we reach out. I think it's going to be a learning process, getting this right. It's going to take us time. We welcome feedback. If there are things we could do better to make it more accessible, we want to do those things. So it's going to require a lot of partnership between the outside community and the feds.
Well, that's a perfect segue. And thank you for inviting feedback. Chiraag, as you are aware, in February of this year, Race Forward and Policy Link released the findings from an assessment that was conducted for a sample of the federal equity action plans that were prepared. And the assessment was an opportunity to look at what was prepared, to explore where there may be opportunities for improvement, where there may be opportunities for growth. But my question for you is, from your vantage point, from where you sit, where are the big wins in terms of the work from the past 2 years, and where do you think there's the most opportunity for continued growth?
Yeah, and thank you for that assessment. I meant it when I said that we are looking for feedback. I read that carefully, and we look carefully at all the input we get. In terms of big wins, I began to speak about this. I think there's a lot that we have to be proud of over the last couple of years. The president has led on this, and we've seen real results from his emphasis on equity. So just to give a few examples, in particular spaces, in the criminal justice space, the president was a huge champion of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We know that a lot of the push for equity was built on generations of advocacy and then a social movement that occurred just before the president took office around justice and law enforcement. The policy solution there was a bill that we wanted to see signed into law in Congress. That's not the entirety of it, but it would have made a major difference. And unfortunately, after passing the House, due to Republican opposition in the Senate, it hit a wall and the legislation did not advance. At that point, the president said, I'm going to do everything in my power through executive action to advance the cause of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And he ran and we, as a staff, ran a consultative process with people who are most impacted. We met with family members of people whose loved ones had been killed at the hands of law enforcement. We met with law enforcement. We met with unions. We met with advocacy and civil rights organizations, members of Congress, state legislators and attorneys general to gather up all the best ideas. And on May 25th, 2022, the 2-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, the president signed an executive order that is sweeping, 10,000 words, and tries to take as many of the reforms in the George Floyd Act as possible and require them of federal law enforcement to set the standard for what the rest of the nation's law enforcement should look like. It had certain other levers in it to more directly impact state and locals as well. But that's a big win, and one that I think speaks to the three of us have been talking about in terms of policy development being shaped by those who are most impacted by it, right? Again, at this signing ceremony, you had members of major law enforcement organizations, families of loved ones who had died due to police violence, civil rights organizations, all standing up and applauding that the president had signed this executive order. And implementing that is going to be a major challenge going forward. So I would say that is a major opportunity, challenge and opportunity. I would say it's an accomplishment, but also one of the opportunities. The president took other steps in the criminal justice arena that are worth mentioning. Marijuana, maybe I'll just mention that one. The president's long talked about our failed approach to marijuana. In October of last year, he signed a categorical pardon for all simple possession of marijuana charges, federal charges and DC charges, and said if you were convicted of a federal or DC offense for simply possessing marijuana, it is pardoned. And we've seen very few of these categorical across-the-board pardons. Normally you have to apply, your application sits for a long time, and you may or may not get relief. Here he said, I'm giving relief to everyone. He urged state governors to do the same because we know that 90% of these charges happen at the state level. And he asked the Departments of Health and Human Services and Justice to reevaluate how marijuana is scheduled. Right now, it's at the highest severity of the drug schedule, has the most restrictions on it. That process is underway. I think there are wins in other spaces in terms of LGBTQI communities. The president has been the most pro-LGBTQI plus president in history. He's spoken directly to transgender youth around the country who are facing attacks from state legislatures throughout the nation and said, I have your back. I see you. I'm with you. And The administration is pursuing rulemakings to expand civil rights protections to protect them. And then I'll just mention one more. I think we've seen a lot in the economic development space as well. The president made a commitment when he went to Tulsa on the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre in 2021. And he there said, we are going to increase the amount of federal contracting dollars that go to small disadvantaged businesses. These are businesses owned by Black and Brown Americans, by women and other socially disadvantaged groups. And he set a target. Right now it's about 10%. I'm going to move it up to 15%. I want to see us move it up to 15%. And he, again, charged the agencies to do that. That was actually reflected in the EO that the president signed in February to formalize that commitment. And we know that that is a way to address the racial wealth gap. We know that when people of color own businesses and they're small businesses, are more likely to hire other folks from their communities, and that benefits the larger community economically. So it's a major strategy that I think we have seen a lot of progress in already.
We have seen some really historic advances, right? You've covered some of them, some of the bold policies that were pioneered during COVID in order to keep people afloat. These are new conversations around criminal justice and acknowledgement of the need for some reparative interventions. But the other thing that is unfortunately historic, part of the cycle of history at least, is that backlash is the shadow of progress, right? And we're now seeing that backlash continue to bubble up in very dangerous ways. Banning of books, banning of curriculum, recent proposal to actually prohibit the collection of racially disaggregated data so that we don't even see the suffering. The headwinds are powerful. So I know this isn't an easy question, but what are your thoughts on how we sustain these wins? Reverend Barber calls this the third Reconstruction, and that there was severe backlash after the first two, so we shouldn't be surprised. What do you want people to be thinking about? How should we be working, thinking, collaborating to sustain some of these historic breakthroughs?
It takes fortitude, and it's not easy. You're right that there's a backlash. You're right that there has been a backlash every time there has been progress toward a more equitable nation. We are seeing that now, and you gave a number of examples of it. And it's important for leaders to not be cowed by those kinds of attacks. That's actually why the president signing the second executive order in February is so meaningful to me, personally, and I think to the nation. He's saying at the very moment that the headwinds are increasing, at the very moment that the backlash appears to be crescendoing in some states and some corners of Congress, he will not be cowed. Equity benefits all of us. This is not about special interests, some groups over others. It's about the country working for everyone who lives in it. And we're not going to accept the move to ban books, prohibit children from learning about our history. The president often says great nations aren't afraid of their history. They face up to it. And we're a great nation. So let's face up to it. Why should we be afraid to read about our flaws, to hear criticism? We'll only get better if we do so. And that is the ethos that has driven the president and this administration. And we're going to carry that forward. I would urge others to do the same, to know that they have a partner in this White House when it comes to insisting on forward progress and not being afraid, because it is difficult. And again, that partnership is going to be necessary. The White House can't do it alone. Advocates on the outside can't do it alone. Members of Congress who are trying to build, a more equitable set of laws can't do it alone. We need each other. And that's the kind of approach we're going to be taking going forward.
I should have asked you this question actually to start, but now that we are talking about the backlash, it occurs to me that what equity means, especially what racial equity means, has been, one could say, mischaracterized, weaponized. And a lot of people might hear, President signed a racial equity order for the whole of government, but they may not know exactly what that means. So maybe just to share with our listeners, what is it What is the executive order? What does it actually mean in the day-to-day work of government before we move on to the next set of themes?
Yeah, I think you are right that equity is being weaponized and mischaracterized. Again, it's not about special interests or preferences for some groups over others. It is about examining where we have fallen down, where there have been barriers that have kept people out, and taking those barriers down because they're not legitimate and they're not defensible. People are often surprised to find that when they do find out that our equity agenda includes rural communities. We are very focused on the fact that there has been massive underinvestment in rural communities over the years. One strategy that we're undertaking is that the U.S. Department of Agriculture launched an enterprise called the Rural Partners Network. Although it's led out of USDA, it's an all-of-government approach. There are more than a dozen agencies that are involved, and they are directly supporting, as a kind of pilot, 36 different communities in 11 states and territories, to include tribal communities, with understanding what federal grant opportunities are available, how to apply for them, how to think about their proposals and what will be most competitive before applying, and going through the entire process together. They have federal field staff in these 36 communities, and then they have at the home base at the agencies a point person at every agency who is a front door for these rural communities to have partners, because we know that rural communities are largely disadvantaged when it comes to knowing how to navigate the extremely complex federal grant making process. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars and people just being locked out of it. I use that example to try to explode the notion that equity is only for Black and brown communities, for example. Certainly it is. Racial equity is an important part of the conversation, and we have to name that and talk about it broader. And it's a way of illustrating that when we focus on where we have fallen short with particular communities on particular issues, we make our programs better for all Americans. And I think you're seeing that. We've had record drops in unemployment. We've had more insured Americans than ever before. We've had explosive small business development. More than 10 million small businesses in the last 2 years have been started. That helps everyone. And it's a product of this emphasis this emphasis of the president that we need to be lifting everyone up.
Right. And let's remember there are lots of Black and brown people in rural communities too, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I want to revisit the markers that you introduced earlier, because as 2022 ended, the administration had the opportunity to talk about the economic gains. And as we have this conversation about racial equity, it's important to think more critically about economics as well. And one of the things that the administration was able to demonstrate is that the goals of encouraging equity, centering equity in public policy, and the goals of having a healthy economy are not mutually exclusive. From where you sit, what is the message that we really need to offer to the public so that they understand as well that these goals are not mutually exclusive? They are complementary to one another. And that in the end, if you want to have a healthy economy, you have to address the other.
Absolutely. We do not see any tension between our equity agenda and our economic opportunity agenda. And I think that's borne out, as I mentioned a moment ago, in the numbers you're seeing. Right? We have seen record drops in unemployment across the board for all communities. It's borne out in the economy, the way in which we had the most equitable recovery from COVID in memory. That means economic recovery, right? We saw communities bounce back, and that was due to the historic, bold action that Congress and the president took. The American Rescue Plan brought back to parity communities in 1 year compared to prior recoveries where it took 6 years. So I think all Americans have benefited from the administration's focus on equity, as well as its focus on an economy that works for everyone. The president often talks about an economy that grows from the bottom up and the middle out, right? He also often talks about how the most wealthy among us need to pay our fair share. In fact, he just proposed a budget that would involve raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans in order to safeguard social programs that help all of us, Medicare, case in point. And that is I think, a message of equity. What I just said about the budget and about bottom up and middle out doesn't use the word equity, but it is about equity. It is about a social support system, right? A healthcare system, and there are a number of other examples that we could select from that benefit everyone who needs support.
So let's touch on what the administration where you sit, or what we've all collectively learned from the really painful experience of the pandemic. We lost a lot of people. We saw the disproportionate deaths at the onset in Black and brown communities. We saw some of those gaps close over time. We also saw uneven distribution of economic pain, and then we saw some policy interventions to mitigate that. A lot of bold interventions were made. What do you feel we've learned, that the administration has learned, at the intersection of race and the pandemic experience?
I think what we learned and what we took to heart in developing our policy responses was that communities that are already disadvantaged to begin with due to systemic racism or discrimination or disinvestment are going to be hit hardest. They were hit hardest when society-wide catastrophes happen, like COVID-19 pandemic. And we have to be intentional about addressing those gaps. And we were in this case. We have a COVID response team here at the White House. From the earliest days, it had a COVID-19 health equity task force that focused on these issues. When we thought about our mitigation strategies, vaccination and getting vaccination rates to parity was critical. Rewind to the beginning of 2021, mid-2021, you saw disparate vaccination rates with Americans of color much less likely to be vaccinated than white Americans. Today, you have parity, white, Black, brown, and Native American. And that wasn't by accident. That was by deliberate outreach strategies, by placement of vaccination sites in places where communities could get them. We were intentional about rural communities, which are often people have to travel farther to get their vaccinations, trying to make them available in closer locations to them. It took that kind of equity-minded policy development process to address the pandemic. And then it wasn't just COVID, of course, it was the economic consequences. And there too, we were intentional about policy that would address the gaps, lift up all Americans, and ideally, as the president always says, build back better. And that is what you saw with the expanded child tax credit, $300 a month to people in 2021 who had a child at age 6 or above, $250 if they were under 6. And the expansion of the earned income tax credit as well. These are big programs that helped a lot of people and that rebuilt our economy in very short order and saved us from what would have been just much more difficult circumstances. That also gave rise, the president has a whole agenda around reforms that are needed to strengthen our economy and to help families and children. Paid leave, paid annual leave, sick leave, childcare. These are programs we have not yet been able to get enacted. We did hit a roadblock there. It's part of the continuing agenda, but certainly not something the president's giving up on. He's going to continue to champion these kinds of reforms because they address the inequities and they strengthen the economy for all Americans.
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying is that at the heart of the racial equity effort and order is actually just being intentional.
You're in a trailblazing role, and I think it's important for people to understand, what does that really mean in terms of the gravity of it? Obviously, there are a lot of things you probably reflect on in your day-to-day work. And I'm curious in terms of what are you particularly proud of as you serve in this role as the Deputy Director of the Domestic Policy Council on Racial Justice and Equity? And how has your past experience, especially your work with organizations like Demos, how has that helped to inform the work that you're currently doing?
Well, I'm incredibly honored and proud to have this role and to work for a president who created it. Again, truly historic that there is a racial justice and equity team at the Domestic Policy Council. Ambassador Susan Rice leads DPC. She is the champion on all of these issues, including racial equity and support for all underserved communities. And The structure was created so there was a whole team focused on these issues, and I have the privilege of leading that team. That makes a difference when it comes to White House coordination of cross-agency actions and policy development. What we do here is we run processes to surface the best ideas, create options, and then land on policy decisions, often making recommendations to the president and having him make the final decision. That process run out of DPC with a team that is known as the Racial Justice and Equity Team is extremely robust. We just would not be able to drive forward and execute on the president's executive orders on these issues if we didn't have this level of support from the president himself and from the leadership more broadly in the White House. So I'm very proud of the existence of this team and the work that they've done over the first couple of years. I am also proud of the way that agencies have stepped up. This has not been, it has been difficult, but it has not been a matter of massive resistance or anything like that. Agencies are hungry to do their work in a more equitable way because they want their programs to work for all Americans. And they know that historically that has not been the case. And some of them know that there is a history of discrimination in the government programs that they are leading, and they're trying to change that. It is always thrilling for me to hear from them the way in which White House leadership matters to their day-to-day. The fact that they can point to an executive order signed on the first day and a follow-up signed on roughly the 2-year mark and say the president cares about these issues, we need to do better, matters to their day-to-day work. In terms of my own arc and the places I've been before, you mentioned Demos, a nonprofit I worked for. I also worked at the Justice Department on civil rights issues. And those positions certainly did prepare me and I think changed the way in which I do the work. Hard to say exactly, but I think I do the work differently. And the reason is that I have a strong sense of the larger ecosystem of advocacy and social change. And, we're here because we believe government has a role to play in improving people's lives. That's what Democrats believe generally. That is what people who work in public service believe generally. And it is a heartfelt mission. And having been at a nonprofit organization that works with grassroots organizations, that works with people who are directly impacted by policy choices that are made on criminal justice, on the racial wealth gap, on whether we're living out our trust and treaty obligations for tribes, I can see here how much our work matters and how important it is to benefit from the wisdom and brilliance of people in the communities who are most impacted. It is a cliched criticism of Washington that we're out here in DC and we're not connected to communities and we're just, making decisions without appropriate input or based on politics. And that is not how I experience the job here. And I think it's in part because it's certainly because of the president's emphasis. It's also in part because of the engagement I've had with directly impacted communities around the country. It's a broad and diverse nation with so many different constituencies. And the White House, the federal government, needs to serve all of them. And it's something I try to bring to the work.
So let's talk about how that happens. Of course, it's crucial that there's a mandate, right? That there's political commitment, that there's shared belief. But that's part of the equation, right? The racial equity practice is a skill. It's a way of governing differently. It's a way of doing work differently. And there are thousands upon thousands of public servants who have never been asked to do that, nor necessarily offered the support to build those skills and approaches. So what do we need to collectively do to support those public servants to truly transform government so it is government for everyone?
Yeah, I truly believe we're doing something that has not been attempted before in the federal government. As you well know, it has been attempted and is being done at the local level, and some other countries are experimenting with it as well. But, we have to be very intentional and thoughtful about the particular processes and structures we set up within agencies so that they can do this work in a way that their policy development and execution is equitable. And let me get more specific about that. One of the things that the new executive order does is it requires every agency to have an equity team, an agency equity team. And that team, specifically, according to the executive order, has to cut across their various functions. It needs people from leadership, budget, IT, personnel, every important program office. It's got to be a broad team that represents the entire agency. Not only that, but the executive order also requires that agencies designate a senior accountable official who will be tasked with and responsible for ensuring that the agency action plans, the equity action plans, are done in a timely manner and that they measure up to the level of boldness and ambition that the president is requiring. The other thing that's important here to think about is that there are particular ways of doing this work. And I think you're referring to this, Cathy, right? Equity tools, doing equity impact assessments in the same way that we've done in the environmental context, building data systems that allow us to track the impact of our programs. You mentioned that there is a push in some corners against collecting data, demographic data, for example. That could not be more wrongheaded. We will not know if we're having an impact and if we're benefiting all communities if we don't collect that data. And we've made progress on that. There was an equitable data working group created by the first executive order. It was given additional responsibilities over time. And it has been critical to, assessing how we're doing on unemployment insurance, making sure that we know where infrastructure funding is going and identifying gaps, regional gaps, for example, and doing further outreach if we're seeing those gaps. So data is a big one as well. These are just a few examples of the kinds of things that agencies need to start doing. And some have started. We have made progress in the first couple of years. But as I said earlier, it's a generational commitment. We're building a muscle. We're going to have to do this year over year to get good at it. And we need to be transparent and public about the work that we're doing. Thankfully, there are experts outside. Your organizations are among those experts that we can benefit from. And some agencies have built those partnerships in getting feedback and designing their equitable policymaking tools, in assessing impact. And we're going to need to do a lot more of that. From the White House, we are offering support directly from the Domestic Policy Council and also from the Office of Management and Budget, which has a kind of a learning agenda where they're constantly offering trainings to staff about how to do this work and what it means and how to ensure that it is impactful in a way that endures, not fleeting, that it actually will have an impact in people's lives over time. And the last thing I'll say is that we're also trying to improve coordination within the White House to offer better support to the agencies. The executive order creates something called the White House Steering Committee on Equity. What that does is to try to make sure that all of us here at the White House are talking to each other when we are providing input on agency actions or options, that we're doing so in a coherent way and that they're not getting, asked 50 different ways from 50 different people about the same priorities. I think that'll make a big difference to their lives as well, and will offer them the kind of support that they need.
There's all this intense work happening to strengthen government, right? To learn to ask the right questions, get the right data, learn and be intentional, build up the public. And at the same time, we see not just a backlash on racial equity, but a backlash on democracy itself, right? An assault on our democratic institutions and values. The president has mentioned that as a priority, not just in the United States, but globally. Here at Race Forward, we see a deep connection between racial justice and democracy. Our president is often quoted as saying, you can't have racial justice without democracy, or democracy without racial justice. How does the administration see the link between protecting, advancing, or actually creating a real democracy for the first time in the U.S. by making it a government for all, and the racial justice and equity efforts?
These are very much linked. Equity is another way of saying democracy. I think at the end of the day, what is democracy but rule based on the consent of the governed? And democratic systems need to deliver to make democracy worth having and pursuing. Shockingly, we are facing real questions around the world about the value of democracy. And one of the things the president has emphasized is that democracies do deliver for the public. And for that to be true, our democracy has to deliver for all Americans. So that's why the equity work is so critical. And it is not a matter of one administration's priorities. It's a matter of the future of this country. We have seen brazen attacks on our democracy, most notably with the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. We saw 140 police officers injured. We saw 5 die. People were smashing walls. And that was all part of the big lie, right? That President Biden not actually won the election. That's not how we do democracy in this country. We believe in the peaceful transfer of power. We count the votes. Every eligible voter's vote gets counted. And so there are some long-standing challenges in our democracy, right? Equal access to the ballot, stopping all voter suppression. These are challenges that we're going to have to continue to work toward. We really need legislation. I'm just going to take this opportunity to say the president has been a champion of the Voting Rights Advancement Act, renamed the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as well as the Freedom to Vote Act. These are 2 bills that would help combat discrimination in voting and make it easier to vote by mail, to have early voting, to ensure that the millions of Americans who are currently eligible to vote but not even registered today actually get on the rolls and then can participate, because we need everyone's voice to be counted. That really should not be a partisan or political message. That's something we should all be able to get behind. Everyone who is eligible should be able to register to vote and have their ballot counted. That legislation has hit a roadblock in Congress. The president said he doesn't think the filibuster should be an obstacle when it comes to this legislation, right, that is necessary to protect our democracy. We have made some progress, however. The president signed into law the Electoral Count Reform Act, legislation that'll make it harder to have the kind of assault on democracy that we saw on January 6th, where people were trying to say that the vice president could change the result or we could interrupt the counting of ballots. Ambiguities in a 1800s law called the Electoral Count Act were addressed in that bipartisan legislation. The president also signed an executive order on voting information and access. That's about trying to use federal agencies to make it easier for people to learn about their right to vote and register to vote. And we are busy implementing that and will continue to do so. But this is a much bigger question when it comes to democracy, and equity is absolutely at the core of it. We need to make sure that this country's government works for all Americans. I don't know how to describe that any other way than democracy.
We're both curious, what kind of reception is the administration receiving as you travel around the country and as you engage people concerning the administration's position on racial equity? What are you hearing from localities, from states, from elected officials in this moment?
There's a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest in the work that the administration is doing. In some cases, there are localities that have been trying to do equity work, racial equity work for some time, and are happy to have a partner in the federal government. In many cases, they're interested now to do something similar on their own end. We know that a significant amount of policymaking gets done at the very local level. What is your city council deciding? What is your mayor's agenda? Or state legislatures. And many of these processes are, because of our federalist system, completely apart. They're completely apart from our federal policymaking processes. And they're increasingly interested in what we're doing. I will say that there is this backlash that we discussed earlier. So there are people who are trying to politicize the equity work, characterize it as kind of special preferences for some and not all. And make people afraid that they're going to lose something if someone else gets something. That is not what the equity agenda does, right? That what the equity agenda does is trying to address gaps, fill those gaps, and make government work better across the board, which will benefit all of us. For those folks who are part of the backlash, it's not as productive a conversation. Right? That's a very political conversation, and we have not been able to have as much policymaking discussion, although we're always willing to talk. But across the country and even outside of the country, I would say there is interest. In fact, in January, the United States signed an agreement to create a system of information sharing with Mexico and Canada on racial equity and equity work more broadly. And all of this, engaging with state and locals, community groups, talking to other countries, is a reflection of our awareness that this work is new, that it is hard and that we don't have all the answers ourselves. So we're going to need to continue to work with everyone who wants to be part of this conversation.
Chiraag, we cannot thank you enough for joining us. I'm going to close out by thanking your team and you for your fortitude. We know this work is draining. We know being inside the administration means you're getting hit on all ends. And we want to just appreciate that work you're doing for communities of color across the country, sometimes not really getting the recognition that I know that people of color in government don't get. But we see you. We thank you. We encourage the fortitude that you are urging, and we wish you all success.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute privilege to do this work, and it has been a lot of fun having this conversation with you.
Thank you for joining us for what has been a landmark episode for Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. Thank you to Chiraag Bains, as well as Robbie Ha, Special Assistant for Economic Mobility and Racial Justice and Equity at the Domestic Policy Council, for working with the Race Forward team to make this episode happen. Thank you to the co-host team, Cathy, Albisa, and Carlton, Eley, who did a phenomenal job. My co-executive producer, the Vice President of Strategic Communications and Public Engagement, Cheryl Blakemore. Our senior video producer, Ty Rose. And a special thank you to the Race Forward leadership that made the way for this moment with work that goes all the way back to the beginning of the Government Alliance and Race and Equity work. Julie Nelson, Senior Vice President of Programs, and Race Forward President Glenn Harris, whose passionate story of the decades-long work with GARE inspired this project. And lastly, thanks to you, the listeners. The heights that this podcast has been able to reach is because of your support and dedication to the racial justice work. If you enjoy what you heard today and want to support the podcast with a tax-deductible gift, text RFPOD to 44321. That's RFPOD to 44321. Listen to all of our episodes of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And make sure to follow to receive our latest episodes as soon as they drop. And follow Race Forward on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Until next time, this has been Handaleva. Together, we'll keep the momentum going.